Israel and Hamas, as well as the mediators, haven't really said anything specific in their discussions about a possible ceasefire in Gaza. But as Charles was saying, the broad proposal is believed to be based on a three-stage process. So the first phase would be a 6-week ceasefire during which Hamas would release women, the elderly and wounded captives in exchange for Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. And the second phase would include a permanent end to the hostilities, as well as the release of all remaining Israeli captives. Then the third phase would be the reconstruction of Gaza and the return of the remains of any deceased captives to Israel. We have with us Daniel Levy, who's the president of the Independent Policy Institute, the U.S. Middle East Project. He's also a former Israeli peace negotiator, joining us from London. Welcome back to Al Jazeera, Daniel Levy. So Charles was just saying that going into these talks, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presented a list of what he said were 4 non-negotiable Israeli demands, including a guarantee that Israel could resume fighting at any point if there was a ceasefire. So this has angered some in Israel, as well as some mediators, accusing him of attempting to sabotage any progress. Having said that, going into these talks, what are the chances of a breakthrough, in your opinion?
Doreen, it's good to be with you. I think you just kind of answered your own question. The chances for a breakthrough are very slim because Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it's not exactly breaking news, continues to do everything to undermine those prospects. It raises the question that why have the US administration been lying to us since President Biden gave that speech outlining the plan on May 31, when they've been telling us for weeks, Israel accepts it, it's all good, there's only one problem, Hamas. That's not true. Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that if he insists on continuing the war, the devastation, the destruction, what we saw again yesterday in Khan Yunis, what we see every day, the mass daily civilian killing events, he knows that if he insists on continuing that, there can't be a deal, because any effort to create some kind of constructive ambiguity is totally blown up by his very clear insistence. So people have been looking at this and saying, Hamas gave some clarifications on what constitutes plausible guarantees that they would consider enough to go into the deal. People hope that maybe the Israeli parliament going on recess would give Netanyahu some political wiggle room. The Israeli security establishment is more clearly in favor of a deal. They know that their own troops are somewhat exhausted and this is going nowhere. The Americans are perhaps more desperate. So that added up to maybe there's some optimism, but that has been once again totally negated by the Israeli Prime Minister. And let me tell you, Doreen, some of the Israeli journalists are being honest and telling us that they are being fed information and they're being told they have to quote this as military sources on the Israeli side, but it's coming from the Prime Minister's office and it is designed intentionally to create obstacles on the path to a deal.
But here's the thing, Daniel. I mean, could this idea of phases, these 3 phases, and starting off with a short-term ceasefire, create the space for an actual end to the war that it would make it harder for Israel to resume due to some of the pressures that you speak of on the Prime Minister, as well as his own troops being exhausted?
So that's the design. You're absolutely right. That's the structure they've tried to give this. And that kind of thing can perhaps work because you go into this with an intention, a commitment, at least on the part of the mediators, that this will continue, knowing it's fragile, and then you try and create realities on the ground, getting in that desperately needed humanitarian assistance, withdrawal, at least in part in the initial phase of the Israeli forces, and you try and create layer upon layer of reality, which makes a return to the current horrors more difficult. But in order to do that, you have to have some kind of willingness to go along with that on the part of the Israeli government, the Israeli leadership. So if Netanyahu were to not commit, but were to keep quiet, or to say things that could perhaps be lent to dual interpretation, but he quite categorically doesn't do that. And therefore, the structure is of plausible phase by phase, with a degree of uncertainty, that structure is undermined by the certainty expressed by the Israeli leader. And then you go back into the question of, okay, how do you change that calculation?
Right.
And because the US is unwilling to use its leverage, because it still sends all those weapons, it is unwilling to change that calculation.
But behind closed doors, when it comes to these negotiations, Daniel, how much pressure do you think the likes of William Burns and Brett McGurk are actually putting on the Israelis at this point? And from what you know, this time around, how much leeway does the Israeli negotiation team have? Because in the past, they weren't given the mandate. Do they have it this time around?
From everything we know, Doreen, the answer to that is negative, that the mandate is still very limited. And in terms of what's the pressure behind closed doors, well, here's the thing. If they're saying one thing behind closed doors, but then Netanyahu is confident that in public, President Biden will simply go back to a narrative that blames the other side, not the Israeli side, and to a reality in which Israel gets enough and virtually everything that it wants from the Americans, and that Netanyahu has been invited by the Republican and the Democrat congressional leadership to address that body at the end of this month. And he knows he can go there and have a lot of fun, in his terms, with that speech. So the quiet, we are telling you this in quiet, we won't say it in public, it doesn't work. It's weakness, and it's all a bit pathetic set against the horrors that we see and the fact that we're now in summer, it's hot, the starvation, the desperation, the ongoing inability to get supplies in, Israel preventing that, what's going on in northern Gaza. When you look at that big picture and you look at what the US is bringing to the table, I think one has to draw a very depressing, sad conclusion and hope that change, but only public pressure may change it.
Okay, Daniel Levy, thank you so much for joining us from London.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.